Elvis Presley was pumping gas at a Texaco station outside Vicksburg, Mississippi on August 16, 1989, exactly 12 years after the world believed he died. The man who photographed him that day kept the image hidden for 35 years, and what finally made him reveal it would shake the foundation of everything we thought we knew about the king of rock and roll. But to understand why this photograph matters, why it's different from every other Elvis sighting claim, and why the man who took it waited decades to come forward, we need to go back to that sweltering August afternoon when everything changed for a struggling insurance adjuster named Marcus Webb. Marcus was driving through Mississippi on his way back to Memphis after inspecting flood damage in Louisiana. His marriage was falling apart, his company was downsizing, and he just learned his daughter needed surgery they couldn't afford. He was 47 years old and felt like his entire life was collapsing around him. The air conditioning in his 1987 Ford Taurus had broken somewhere around Natchez, and by the time he pulled into that Texaco station just off Highway 61, he was drenched in sweat and questioning every decision he'd ever made. The station was one of those forgotten places you pass without noticing. Just a few pumps and a small convenience store with a faded Coca-Cola sign hanging crooked in the window. It was 3:47 in the afternoon, and the heat was so oppressive that the air seemed to shimmer above the concrete. Marcus pulled up to pump number 3, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment with his eyes closed, trying to summon the energy to face what was waiting for him back home in Memphis. When he finally opened his door, he noticed the man at pump number 1, tall, maybe 6 feet, wearing dark sunglasses despite the glare, dressed in a simple black shirt and jeans that seemed too heavy for the weather. His hair was dark, going gray at the temples, swept back in a style that seemed oddly familiar, yet decades out of fashion. The man was filling up an old Cadillac, a 1973 Eldorado in white with Tennessee plates, and something about the way he moved, the way he held himself with a kind of weary dignity, made Marcus pause. There was something in the man's profile, in the curve of his jaw, and the way his lip curled slightly even though he wasn't smiling, that triggered something deep in Marcus's memory. But it couldn't be. Elvis Presley had died 12 years ago, almost to the day. Marcus had been 35 years old when the news broke, remembered exactly where he was standing in his kitchen when his wife called him to the television. He'd grown up listening to Elvis, had seen him perform once at the Mid-South Coliseum in 1974, had mourned like millions of others when the king passed away at Graceland. But this man at pump number 1 moved like Elvis. He had that same unconscious grace, that way of existing in space that suggested he was used to being watched even when he thought no one was looking. Marcus found himself staring, unable to look away, his exhaustion forgotten. The man finished pumping gas and started walking toward the convenience store, and as he passed Marcus's car, he glanced over briefly. Just a second, maybe less, on their eyes meeting through Marcus's windshield. And in that instant, Marcus saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. The man's eyes behind those dark glasses held a kind of deep sadness, a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. It was the look of someone who had given up everything and was still paying the price. Then the man was gone, disappeared into the store, and Marcus was left sitting in his car with his heart pounding, wondering if the heat had finally driven him crazy. He should have just pumped his gas and left. He should have convinced himself he was seeing things. That grief and stress and the oppressive Mississippi heat were playing tricks on his mind. But something made him reach for the camera on his passenger seat. Marcus always carried a camera for insurance work, documenting flood damage and fire sites and accident scenes. It was a decent 35mm Nikon with a telephoto lens, professional quality, not something he'd planned to use that day, except maybe to photograph his daughter when he got home. His hands were shaking as he raised the camera, checked that there was film, and adjusted the focus. Through the lens, he could see into the convenience store through the plate glass window. The man was at the counter, buying cigarettes it looked like, talking to the clerk who seemed completely uninterested. Just another customer on another boring afternoon. Marcus's finger hovered over the shutter button. This was insane. This was a random stranger who happened to look vaguely like someone famous. This was his mind desperately grasping for anything to distract from the reality of his failing life. But he pressed the button anyway, heard the mechanical click of the shutter, felt the camera advance the film. He took 3 more shots in quick succession, capturing the man as he left the store, as he walked back to the Cadillac, as he opened the driver's door and paused for just a moment, looking out across the empty highway as if remembering something painful. Then the man got in his car and drove away, heading south on Highway 61, and Marcus was left sitting there with a camera full of film and a story he knew no one would believe. He didn't tell his wife when he got home that evening. He didn't mention it when his daughter asked why he was so quiet during dinner. That night, lying in bed unable to sleep, he kept replaying the encounter in his mind, analyzing every detail, the way the man moved, the profile. That momentary eye contact that felt like looking into an abyss of loneliness and regret. But it couldn't be Elvis. Elvis was dead. There had been a funeral, a body, an autopsy. Millions of people had mourned. The idea that Elvis had somehow faked his death and was now pumping gas in Mississippi was the kind of ridiculous conspiracy theory that Marcus would normally dismiss without a second thought. But he couldn't shake what he'd seen, couldn't stop thinking about that moment of connection, brief as it was. He had the film developed the next day, telling himself he was just curious, that once he saw the photos, he'd realize how wrong he'd been. He went to a 1-hour photo place in a strip mall, gave them the roll, waited nervously for what felt like an eternity. When the clerk handed him the envelope of prints, Marcus's hands were trembling so badly he could barely open it. He pulled out the photos right there at the counter, and what he saw made his knees weak. The first image showed the man in profile through the store window, his face partially visible past his sunglasses. The resemblance was undeniable, striking, impossible to dismiss as coincidence. The distinctive jawline, the shape of his nose, the way his hair fell across his forehead. The second photo captured him from a slightly different angle, and you could see more of his face, the lines around his mouth, the heaviness in his expression. The third showed him walking back to his car, his posture and gait so achingly familiar that Marcus felt tears spring to his eyes for reasons he couldn't fully explain. And the fourth, the last one, showed the man paused by the car door, when looking off into the distance, and something about this image was different. It captured a moment of such profound sadness and isolation that it transcended questions of identity. Whoever this man was, he was carrying a weight that seemed almost unbearable. Marcus stood in that photo shop for a long time, staring at the images, trying to decide what to do. He could go to the newspapers. He could go to the tabloids who would pay good money for photos like these. He could become famous, could finally have the financial security his family desperately needed. But something held him back. There was something in that man's eyes, in his body language, in the way he'd looked out across that empty highway, that spoke of someone who had sacrificed everything for privacy, for escape, here for the right to exist without being consumed by the very fame that had defined him. If this was Elvis, and Marcus found himself believing more and more that it was, then Elvis had chosen this life, had chosen anonymity over adoration, obscurity over immortality, had chosen in essence to die to the world so he could finally live for himself. And who was Marcus to take that choice away? Who was he to expose this man, to drag him back into a spotlight he'd gone to such extreme lengths to escape? Marcus put the photos back in the envelope, thanked the clerk, and walked out into the Memphis afternoon with a secret that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He didn't tell anyone. Not his wife, not his friends, not the tabloid reporters who would have paid thousands for what he'd captured on film. He put the envelope in a safety deposit box at his bank and tried to move on with his life. But the encounter had changed something fundamental in him. He'd been given a glimpse of something extraordinary, had been entrusted, however accidentally, with a truth that challenged everything everyone believed. And in keeping that secret, in choosing to protect this stranger's privacy over his own financial needs, Marcus found a kind of purpose he'd been missing. His daughter got her surgery. They found a way to pay for it, though it meant years of debt. His marriage survived, though it was never quite the same. His career continued its unremarkable trajectory, neither disaster nor success. But Marcus carried those photographs with him in his mind, thought about them during difficult moments, She drew strength from the memory of that brief encounter with a man who had literally died to escape the prison of his own fame. Years passed, a decade, then another. Marcus's daughter grew up, went to college, got married. His wife developed cancer, fought it, beat it, then fought it again. Marcus himself grew older, retired from his insurance job, settled into the quiet routine of a life lived mostly in the past tense. He never looked at the photographs again, never took them out of that safety deposit box. But he thought about them constantly, wondered if the man he'd seen that day was still alive, still living in some anonymous small town where no one recognized him, still free in the way that only complete obscurity can provide. He wondered if he'd made the right choice in keeping the secret, or if perhaps by revealing the truth, he could have given Elvis's fans some kind of closure, some answer to the questions that had haunted them for decades. But mostly he believed he'd done the right thing. Some sacrifices are too great to betray, some privacies too hard-won to violate. Then in March of 2024, Marcus received a letter that changed everything. It arrived in a plain envelope with no return address, postmarked from Memphis. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message, no signature, nothing to identify the sender. The message was simple and devastating. Mr. Webb, I know about the photographs you took in August 1989 at the Texaco station outside Vicksburg. I know you've kept them secret all these years, and I want to thank you for that. The man in those photographs is my father. He passed away on January 8, 2024. His entire adult life was shaped by a choice he made in 1977, a choice to disappear so completely that even death couldn't find him until he was ready. He lived 47 years beyond when the world thinks he died, lived them quietly and peacefully in a way that his fame never would have allowed. He knew about your photographs. He saw you taking them that day. He spent years afraid you would reveal them, destroy the life he'd built. When you never did, when year after year passed and you remained silent, he came to see you as the only person who truly understood what he'd sacrificed and why. He wanted you to know that your discretion gave him 35 more years of peace. Now that he's gone, really gone this time, I'm writing to tell you that you can release the photographs if you choose. The world deserves to know that he found the freedom he was searching for, but the choice is yours, as it always was. Marcus read the letter 3 times, sitting alone in his kitchen, with hands that shook not from age but from the weight of what he was holding. Elvis Presley hadn't died in 1977. He'd lived until January 2024, had survived in anonymity for nearly half a century, had found the escape that his fame had made impossible. And somehow, impossibly, he'd known about Marcus's photographs, had lived in fear of exposure, and then in gratitude for silence. Marcus went to his bank the next day, retrieved the envelope he hadn't opened in 35 years, and looked at the photographs with older eyes and a fuller understanding. The man in the images wasn't just someone who looked like Elvis. It was Elvis, older, heavier, worn down by years of living in hiding, but unmistakably him. The king of rock and roll pumping gas at a forgotten Texaco station, buying cigarettes like any ordinary person, existing in the blessed anonymity he'd paid for with everything he'd built. But Marcus still didn't release the photographs, not right away. He thought about what the letter had said, about Elvis finding the freedom he'd been searching for, about those 47 years of peace purchased at the price of his own legendary immortality. He thought about what it must have cost Elvis to walk away from everything, from his career, his fans, his daughter, from being Elvis, to choose death over the life he'd been living, to sacrifice his identity so completely that only death could release him from the lie. And Marcus realized that releasing the photographs now, even with permission, even after Elvis's actual death, would be a betrayal of something larger than a promise. It would be a betrayal of the very freedom Elvis had fought so hard to achieve. The world didn't need to know. The truth wouldn't bring closure. It would only open new wounds, create new conspiracies, turn Elvis's hard-won peace into just another tabloid story. But then Marcus received another letter 2 weeks later. This one was from someone identifying themselves as Elvis's daughter, the child he'd left behind in 1977. She wrote about growing up believing her father was dead, about the hole his absence had left in her life, about the questions that had haunted her for decades. She wrote about recently discovering the truth, learning that her father had lived for 47 more years, but had chosen his freedom over any relationship with her. She wrote about her anger, her grief, her desperate need to understand why. And she wrote that she'd learned about Marcus's photographs and she was begging him to release them. Not for the public, not for fame or money or vindication, but because she needed proof that her father had actually found the peace he'd abandoned everything to achieve. She needed to know that his choice, as painful as it was for her, had been worth it. That he'd lived those 47 years with some measure of contentment. That his sacrifice of her had bought him something valuable enough to justify the cost. Marcus sat with that letter for days, reading it over and over, feeling the weight of two impossible choices. One, keep the secret and honor Elvis's wish for eternal privacy, or reveal the truth and give his daughter the closure she desperately needed. There was no right answer, no choice that wouldn't betray someone's trust. In the end, Marcus decided to do something he'd never considered in all those years. He reached out to the daughter directly, asked to meet her in person. They met in Memphis, in a quiet coffee shop, far from Graceland and the tourist crowds. She was 56 years old, and the resemblance to her father was unmistakable. The same eyes, the same curve of the mouth, the same sadness that Marcus had seen in Elvis's face that day in 1989. He brought the photographs with him, but he didn't show them to her right away. First, he told her about that August afternoon, about the heat and the exhaustion and the moment of recognition. He told her about the choice he'd made to keep the secret, about the years of carrying it, about the letter he'd received after her father's death. And then he told her something he hadn't told anyone, something he'd only realized in the years since that encounter. The man he'd photographed hadn't just looked sad or tired or worn down. He'd looked free. Despite everything he'd given up, despite the loneliness that was evident in every line of his body, there had been something in his posture, in the way he'd stood looking out at that empty highway, that spoke of a burden lifted. Elvis Presley had been trapped by his own legend, imprisoned by the love of millions of people who wanted pieces of him that he couldn't keep giving. He'd been dying under the weight of being Elvis, and the only way to save his life was to end it, and to stage his death, disappear so completely that not even his daughter could know the truth, and live out the rest of his days as someone no one recognized or wanted anything from. It was the ultimate sacrifice and the ultimate selfishness, abandoning everyone who loved him so he could finally breathe. And the man Marcus had photographed that day looked like someone who'd made peace with that impossible choice. When Marcus finally showed her the photographs, Elvis's daughter stared at them for a long time without speaking. Tears ran down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. She looked at each image carefully, studying her father's face, seeing him as he'd been in 1989, 12 years after she'd buried an empty coffin and believed the worst grief of her life was over. "He looks different," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "Wow, not just older. He looks like someone I never knew." Marcus nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The man in the photographs wasn't the Elvis the world remembered, the young, charismatic performer with the megawatt smile and the dangerous hip swivel. He wasn't even the later Elvis, bloated and medicated and desperate. He was something else entirely, someone who'd shed the costume of Elvis Presley and found out who was underneath. "Do you think he was happy?" she asked. And Marcus heard in her voice the same question he'd been asking himself for 35 years. "I think he was free," Marcus answered. "I don't know if that's the same thing as happy, but it was what he needed more than anything else in the world." They sat together for hours talking about Elvis and fame and the price of legend. She told him about her complicated feelings, about loving her father while hating what he'd done, about trying to reconcile the man who'd abandoned her with the father she'd adored. And Marcus told her about carrying the secret, about the burden and the privilege of knowing something that could shatter millions of people's understanding of someone they loved. In the end, they made a decision together. They would release one photograph, just one, to the world. Not to prove anything, not to solve the mystery of Elvis's death, but to show that he'd found what he was looking for. The photograph they chose was the last one Marcus had taken, the image of Elvis paused by his car door, looking out at the highway. It showed a man at peace with his choices, free from the legend that had consumed him, finally able to exist as himself rather than as what everyone else needed him to be. When the photograph was released, it created the exact storm of controversy and denial and analysis that Marcus had always feared. Experts examined it, declared it real, declared it fake. Fans argued that Elvis had lived, that he'd died, that the whole thing was a hoax or wishful thinking or proof of a conspiracy that went deeper than anyone imagined. The tabloids ran wild with it, creating elaborate theories about where Elvis had been and what he'd done and why he'd chosen to reveal himself now. But Marcus and Elvis's daughter stayed silent through all of it, never confirming or denying anything beyond the existence of the photograph itself. They'd released it not to answer questions, but to honor a complicated truth. That Elvis Presley had paid the ultimate price for his freedom, had given up everything including his own death, and had found in that sacrifice something he couldn't have found any other way. The photograph didn't prove he'd lived until 2024, didn't confirm any conspiracy theories or solve any mysteries. It just showed a man at a gas station in 1989, and what people chose to see in that image said more about their own needs and beliefs than about any objective truth. Marcus is 82 years old now, and he thinks often about that August afternoon that changed his life in ways he never anticipated. He kept a secret for 35 years, not because he was paid to or threatened into it, but because he understood instinctively that some privacies are sacred, that some escapes cost too much to betray. Elvis Presley was seen at a gas station in 1989, 12 years after the world mourned his death and 35 years before he actually died. Marcus Webb photographed him there, kept the images hidden for decades, and finally revealed them not to prove anything, but to show that the legend found what he'd been searching for all along. The photograph exists now in the public consciousness, debated and analyzed and argued over. But Marcus knows something that all the experts and conspiracy theorists and devoted fans don't know. He knows that the man in that photograph had made peace with his choice, had found in anonymity what fame had stolen from him, and had lived 47 years beyond his own death doing something that should have been simple but was impossible as Elvis Presley. He lived as himself, whoever that was, without the legend and the expectations and the crushing weight of being the king of rock and roll. And in the end, that choice to disappear, to die to everything he'd built so he could finally be alive, was the most Elvis thing he ever did.